It's Game Boy Works, and this is Baseball Redux. As far as I can tell, Nintendo didn't publish Baseball for Game Boy in Europe. Now, Nintendo didn't launch the Game Boy in Europe until late 1990, more than a year after the Japanese and American launches. Unlike with consoles, power standards weren't the issue behind the delay. Nintendo didn't have to worry about reprogramming software for PAL or CCAM, or dealing with 50Hz versus 60Hz timing issues, because the Game Boy came with its own integral LCD screen that had nothing whatsoever to do with international broadcast standards. Nor do they have to worry about making a device designed for 110 or 120 volt power run on 240 volt current, because the Game Boy's power was also integral, 4 AA batteries. And batteries is batteries the world over. No, Game Boy's slow entree into Europe demonstrated Nintendo's lack of interest in that market, which was a dense tangle of different languages and distribution channels. That's one of many reasons Japan and the US have always been Nintendo's main squeezes. So in that light, yes, of course one of the Game Boy's launch titles would be baseball. Japan and America are countries that love baseball the most, and they're the countries Nintendo loves the most. In fact, Nintendo would go on to buy their own team, the Seattle Mariners, a few years after Game Boy's debut. So it's not surprising that Europe never got baseball, and that it got Game Boy so much later than other regions. Not that they honestly missed out on that much. Baseball is no great shakes. As with Alleyway, we can pin much of baseball's lack of ambition, quality, and timelessness on its vintage. In portable video game terms, the launch wave of Game Boy titles fell into an ugly primal phase of evolution. They were the first fish to use their fins to get about on land, more or less. Someday they would evolve into magnificent amphibians, but for that brief moment in history, portable games simply flopped about grotesquely, splashing in the mud as they gasped for air. To the game or sports enthusiast of the year 2018, baseball doesn't offer much in the way of appeal. It may in fact have been the most primitive console-based take on the sport since Atari's home run for the 2600 more than a decade before its own debut. Now, nearly every baseball game plays largely the same because it's based on a real-world sport with firm rules and mechanics. Play always alternates between the batting and pitching phases, with the former supplemented by the option to attempt stealing bases, and the latter giving way to fielding whenever an opposing batter finds the ball. The differences between any two given baseball games comes down to options and presentation, and Baseball for Game Boy has neither worth speaking of. It offers you a whopping 2 teams from which to choose, the choice of whether to play home or visiting team, and which of 4 characters you can field as your starting pitcher. And there's one other option. You can play Japan or USA mode. The only difference between the two is that distances are presented in meters rather than feet in Japanese, and the batters have Japanese names instead of American. Not being familiar with Japanese sports figures circa 1989, I have no idea whether any of these are meant to be thinly veiled references to popular contemporary baseball players. But the team captains in the USA mode are Mario and Luigi, fulfilling Mario's contractual mandate for cameo appearances, so I'm not really sure why anyone wouldn't just play USA mode. Pitching offers a very small amount of control. You slide right or left on the mound to determine the angle from which you make your throw, and then press A once you're satisfied to enter pitching stance. Holding up or down as you pitch the ball modifies the speed to become a slow pitch or a fast ball respectively, and you can alter the curve of the ball's path by pressing left or right as it flies. The batting mechanics are even more limited. You can move freely within the batter's box and swing the bat, and that's it. Still, batting feels like an embarrassment of opportunity and depth compared to fielding. Once your opponent hits the ball, you're better off just letting go of the controls and allowing your tiny men to attempt to field it automatically. They have a tendency to miss when you're playing against the CPU, though the CPU of course doesn't suffer from this issue, but it's better than trying to guess where your fielders are relative to the ball. The camera view follows the ball, or more correctly follows the shadow of the ball, meaning that fielding often involves both the ball, which arcs upward at an impossible angle for a long hit, and your fielders drifting out of sight while the ball is in play. This was long before the idea of scaling graphics for camera zooms came into play for home consoles, and let's be honest, there's no way Game Boy's programmers could have reasonably pulled off that trick on day one anyway. The end result is that the single-player mode in baseball is utterly frustrating. Programming stacks things unreasonably in the CPU's favor, and even once you get the hang of the game's quirk, the sluggish pace of the action makes for a barely interactive experience. No, the only way to reasonably enjoy baseball is to play with another person, which was the point of the game really. It was Nintendo's showcase piece for the Game Boy Link cable. Playing against a friend doesn't fix baseball's flaws, but it does help distribute them in an egalitarian fashion. Of course, the inspiration for baseball's design was Nintendo's NES game by the same title. Released in 1983 in Japan for Famicom and 1985 at the US launch of the NES, NES Baseball practically defined the Japanese console standard for the sport, aesthetically speaking. Its chubby little characters would be repeated in other series like Pro Yaku Family Stadium, aka RBI Baseball, and it basically represented a sort of minimal baseline for tolerable renditions of the sport in the Nintendo phase of the 8-bit era. By 1989, though, the baseball video game genre had evolved well beyond this primitive minimalism. And yet, here we have Game Boy Baseball, which revisited the NES original and stripped it down even further. The NES game actually offered several more options for play than its Game Boy successor, not to mention things like color and a wider viewpoint, thanks to the NES's superior pixel resolution. Like Alleyway, Baseball doesn't include credits. The Intelligent Systems website lists it as part of their collective CV, and given the game's similarity to the R&D1 developed NES Baseball, we can reasonably pin it down as a joint project between the two studios. The only appeal of the game, of course, comes from the link play. For kids who picked up a Game Boy at the Japanese launch, which was not an insignificant number, Baseball was the link cable's killer app. It's not a great rendition of the sport, but it's somewhat more interesting than the old LED sports handsets, and a good excuse to link your system to a friend. The superior Tennis would launch a month after Game Boy's debut, and Tetris less than a month after that. But for a few short weeks, Baseball was the bleeding edge of competitive portable game design. Next on Game Boy Works, it's a Mario.